welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our special guest author is Matthew Kelly, author of Rediscover Catholicism, and it's published by Beacon Publishing. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Doug. Good to be with you.
This is the first time I've been able to corral you to get you here on Bookmark, even though you were actually at EWTN more than 20 years ago, right? For the first time with Mother Angelica.
Yeah, it was a great experience. First time I was on her show, I think it was 94 or 95.
Right.
And in fact, I met Father Mitch for the first time that day as well. Had lunch with him.
Right, and you just were on Father Mitch's show not that long ago. So.
Enjoyed that as well.
So that's great. He looks exactly the same, too.
He does.
Right?
Yes, he does.
He does. So Rediscover Catholicism, a spiritual guide to living with passion and purpose. Now, you've written several books. Was this your first book or your biggest book?
It's definitely the biggest book. It wasn't my first book. I wrote this in 2002. Mm-hmm. And, you know, essentially I just wanted to present sort of my vision of why I love being Catholic so much. Mm-hmm. You know, I think there's a lot of people out there who don't get it. There's a lot of people who don't love being Catholic. And I just looked around at that mm-hmm. and I thought, okay, I want to write a book that sort of presents Catholicism, the genius of Catholicism, for just the average person on the street.
Mm-hmm. Which is who we have to reach. Now, you say right at the beginning, the church, like so many other things in life, is not so much something we inherit from generations past or take over from our predecessors, as it is something on loan for us from future generations. What do you mean? I mean, most of us try and think of it in terms of with the saints and say, well, we owe it to the, you know, the church universal in the sense of, you know, those in heaven and they have a vote too. But you're on loan for the future. What does that mean? I
think the church, in many ways, yes, we inherit the church from generations past, but in other ways, the church is on loan to us from the next generation.
I see.
And so we're custodians mm-hmm. of the church right now.
I mean, it's our job to transfer what we've been given to the next generation.
And our job to transfer something more than what we've been given.
Because that's your whole theme, which is always adding a little more to it, right?
Exactly.
Each thing is incremental. Right?
Yeah, and what sort of church are we going to give to our children, to our grandchildren, to our great-grandchildren? Mm-hmm. I think is a question that should weigh heavy on our minds.
Mm-hmm. Now you start off, you're in a Christ-like way, you kind of have these parables that you like to tell. In a sense, you talk off right at the beginning of this with this story about a strange flu that's affecting the world, and ultimately, at the end of the day, it really comes down to this family's son can save the world, but it means offering his life, which is obviously your retelling of our Lord and the Father. And the thing that's interesting about it is it's kind of, you know, you kind of see it's, oh, that's very obvious, like I see that. But then you go to the idea of he goes to church the following week. They hold a ceremony to honor your son for his phenomenal contributions, but some people sleep through it. Others don't even bother to come because they have better things to do, and some people come with a pretentious smile, pretend to care, while others sit around and say, this is boring. Wouldn't you stand up and say, excuse me, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but the amazing life you have, my son died for you. Perhaps that's the way God feels. When did you come to that understanding of that?
Probably in my late teens. You know, I started to think about my faith in a serious way. I'd been challenged by a friend of my family's to really look at it. But I think there are a lot of people bored at church. I think it's one of the biggest issues we face as a church today. Because when people say they're bored at church, they're not lying.
Right.
You know, they've got no reason to be.
Are they bored because the music isn't good enough, or the mass isn't interesting enough, or why are they bored, do you think?
They don't understand it.
Right.
And I think they don't understand it on two levels in particular. Mm-hmm. One, they don't understand what the Eucharist really is. Mm-hmm. Because even that alone, I mean, if you understand what that really is, it doesn't matter how bad the music is. Mm-hmm. You know? And the other is, I don't think they're taught to come and listen to the voice of God in their life. Because if you're listening to the voice of God in your life, you're never bored. It's impossible to be bored at church if you're listening to the voice of God in your life. Because once you realize these two things, you're given the grace to look beyond a bad homily. And to be honest, you're given the grace to look beyond a good homily. Right. You know, you're given the grace to look beyond bad music and the grace to look beyond good music, because you realize it's about a lot more than these things. You know, it's about receiving Jesus in the Eucharist, and about listening to the voice of God in your life and what God's trying to say to you on any given Sunday. And I think when you come to church with these things in mind, it's impossible to be bored.
Right. Well, why don't you think the majority of Catholics, even the ones who go to Mass on Sunday, and you're talking in a lot of ways initially about dealing with that group, similar to in many ways that EWTN is trying to say there's a group out there who are going to Mass already, who if they were living out their faith, you know what I mean, we could change the world, let alone the church. So with those people, why don't they see that? They go to church, they probably went to CCD or, you know, and they went to Catholic school, but somehow they don't see that. Why?
I guess in some level we've not done a great job of teaching them, you know, how to listen to the voice of God in their life, of teaching them how to personally engage in a Sunday experience of Mass. I think if you look at catechesis, we're sort of, you know, you had this period in the 60s and the 70s where, you know, it was just very soft and very fluffy and very not helpful in lots of ways.
Right.
And then we've swung into a place where now we have really good catechesis from a point of view of we're clear about what our teaching is, but I think we've still got a step to go to really help people to adapt it to their lives, to make it personal and to live it out in a daily way. So rather than just knowing the answer, actually living the answer.
And for people to see you living that answer.
Exactly.
Right, okay. Now, you talk about beginning an attempt to raise morale among Catholics. You talk about what we've had to go through and all the issues today, and the fact that regardless of all the wonderful contributions you kind of go through, you know, like the school system, the healthcare system, all these things that the church has done all these years, you would think we've done none of this. And that suddenly Catholicism, certainly in the United States, let alone in many other places, is seen as this anachronistic, left behind church that's trying to oppress women.
Right. You know, if you look at what's happening in the world today, there's obviously a massive anti-Catholic bias, particularly in the secular media.
Have you run into that personally? Have you dealt with secular media where you got that reaction?
Yeah, no question.
Right.
And then I think on top of that, you've got this ignorance about Catholicism in society, but also among Catholics. You know, we can be pretty ignorant of our history. I think if you poll 100 people on the street in any major city in America today and say, talk to us about Catholicism, they talk to you about abuse. But the history of Catholicism in no way can be seen as a history of abuse.
Right.
You know, it's a horrible part of our life as a church. It's a horrible part of our history. But you can't look at the history of Catholicism and say, oh, it's all been about, you know, abuse, or it's all been about, you know, any of these hot button issues that people would bring up.
Well, it also seems in some ways it's a function of the fact that the church is unique and has been held in such high esteem that when these failings come out, they seem so incredibly bad and evil.
There's no question. Expectations are massively high on anything that's spiritual, on anything that's religious, and particularly on the church that has been around for 2,000 years and has been serving people in very powerful ways for 2,000 years.
Okay. Now you say the past 15 years on the road have convinced me of these things. And now, was this 15 years prior to 2002?
Yeah.
So this is like, okay, another 12 years or so on top of that. Okay. So, and I'm assuming you still have found the same thing. Number one, there is a genius in Catholicism if we'll just take the time and make the effort to humbly explore it. There's nothing wrong with Catholicism, can't be fixed by what is right with Catholicism. If you and I are not part of the solution, we're part of the problem. We've heard that one before. If 67 million Catholics tonight stepped up in a notch, something incredible would happen. Exactly. But they don't. And even the kind of idea, are there really 67 million Catholics in the United States? I know that may be people who might have been baptized at one point in time, and I guess that makes them Catholic. But sometimes I wonder if we're not talking about phantom divisions.
There's no question we are. And obviously, these are Catholics who self-identify as Catholics. So they're still self-identifying, even to secular polls, as Catholic. You know, in the 4 Signs of Dynamic Catholic, we lay out the research that we did, which essentially explored...
That's your other book.
Exactly.
Okay.
Essentially explored the difference between highly engaged Catholics and disengaged Catholics. And the first part of the research did an 80-20 study on Catholic parishes in the United States, and discovered that 6.4% of American Catholics contribute 80% of the finances, and 80% of the volunteerism. So essentially 7% of that, call it 70 million Catholics, are doing everything and paying for everything.
Right.
And we need more of that 7%.
Right. So you're dealing with about 5 million people or something like that out of that number. What's interesting too, and to jump to that just quickly, I was interested in the idea of that small group who kind of does everything in the parish, and I was happy to see that you also brought in the fact that sometimes that's also a function of people not wanting to let others get involved.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, sometimes people read that book or read that research and think, okay, the 7% are perfect. And, you know, they are by no means perfect.
Right.
They can be very territorial. And they do other things that actually alienate the 93%.
Right, exactly. And in fact, sometimes when people see them get up, they go, oh no, it's Doug Keck again. Oh boy, here we go, you know, all right. You know, I'm going to be made to feel bad or inadequate or something else of what I'm not doing right. I always remember Ralph Martin years ago saying, what do you do when you're in your prayer group and somebody joins the group who plays the guitar better than you do or whatever? You know, how do you deal with those kinds of things? Do you see that as an additive, positive step to the group, or is it a threat to you personally?
It's powerful insight, powerful example.
Right. Now you say we need to get back to basics. Okay, how much more basic do we need to get to? What do you mean by basics?
The problem is people don't get it. I think we assume people
They don't
get
get the
it.
faith?
They don't get the faith. They don't get how to live it. They don't get how to digest it. They just don't get it. And I think too much of the time we're operating under the assumption that they do get it. You know, and so we got to go back to basics.
Are we also afraid to make them feel bad about the fact that maybe they don't get it?
I don't know that that's the issue. It might be part of the issue.
We seem to be very concerned about people's feelings about things these days.
I think that's I think that's true. But they just don't know. It's just ignorance. They just need to be
Are we
helped.
afraid to challenge people because we're afraid they'll walk away?
I think we are afraid to challenge people. I think we are afraid to say this is what it means to be Catholic. You know, and as a result, you know, you've got people who are Catholic who are living in some ways anti-Catholic lives, but saying, hey, I'm a Catholic.
I'm a Catholic, right. Now you said with a heavy heart, I acknowledge that it seems that we have a church, that we are without a vision. What do you mean the church doesn't have a vision? Because you also go to say that God never goes back. So we must have a vision if we're going forward.
Well, God has a vision.
Okay.
I think that, you know, if you polled 100 people on the streets or polled 100 Catholics in every city in America today and said, what's the church's vision for this period in time? I think you'd get 100 different answers from 100 different people. So that essentially spells out we don't have a vision, or we're not communicating the vision effectively. You know, I think that we need something that really rouses people. We need something that rallies people, that people can get behind and stand up. You know, I mean, we are an enormous entity, 1.2 billion Catholics on the planet, 70 million Catholics in America. If we came out and said, okay, over the next 10 years, we are going to do X, I think that would be very compelling to people. Or if we came out and said, okay, over the next 5 years, we're going to do Y. We have things like the Year of Faith, but they tend to remain in, you know, what I would call the Catholic ghetto. We don't seem to get them outside of the Catholic realm and into the mainstream.
Or they just are so abstract in people. It's like, okay, well, that's great.
Exactly.
So what does that mean to me?
Exactly.
What am I supposed to do with this? And I think also sometimes we talk about this monolithic 1.2 billion church and the Pope as if somehow we're running this machine, but we all know that, you know, it really is distributive in the sense that you've got dioceses and then you've got parishes and things like that, and they're all individual and they all have their own things going on. And so this idea that we marshal all of these parishes and dioceses together in lockstep, that just never happens.
No, but I think it's something that on some things should be able to happen.
Because one of the things that always strikes me, you know, if Pastor Matt got up in front of his Good Book Baptist and told people that this book is the one everybody here should be reading, I guarantee you that 80% of those people on the way out would pick this book up.
No question.
And now if you're Father Matt and you say the same thing, 80% of those people would be looking at their watches, saying, how am I heading out the door?
Yeah, maybe. But at the same time, there would be a good population who would say, I'm going to get that book, I'm going to give that book a read.
Again, incremental. If we can add to the next group, we can continue to expand it out.
Give me another 7%, like the 7%.
Rather than just hitting a home run.
You change the world.
So we can win with singles and doubles.
No question.
And we can do that stuff. Now, you also struck me with this, because I kind of jumped ahead with the God never goes back. You said, many are calling for a return to the past. These people are reactionaries, not visionaries. Too often their cries are driven by fear of uncertainty and grappling for stability. So is that based on people who think, well, gee, we got to go back to the way it was in the 1950s or something like that?
Well, I think there's people who would like to go much further back than that.
Okay, so you're the medieval period or something.
Yeah, or
Council of Trent, I mean, or...
And, you know, you got people who say, let's be like the first Christians.
Okay.
I mean,
so it could
in
be
every
anybody,
period in history, you've got people who...
Well, they're looking for the perfect church.
Pick any period of time in the past, and they want to go back to that.
Right, and there's no one point in time where things are perfect. Like you say, we're always moving forward, marching through time.
Exactly. Okay. You know, and, you know, when we messed up in the garden...
Right. Yeah,
God could have fixed that.
Right.
He could have put us back in the garden.
He didn't do that.
He didn't do that.
That's what you say, right.
And so what is God's forward plan?
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things you point out, there are many Catholics, non-Catholics alike, who do not want to rediscover Catholicism. Let me ask you a question, too, because you're talking about the percentage of people who might be sitting in church being bored and things like this. I mean, do you think that this is a new phenomena inside the church, or are we just identifying something that in many ways has always existed, but maybe is more obvious because the social constraints of the way people behave outwardly have been removed? I mean, years ago, people lived in Catholic ghettos in many ways, where you went to church because that's what you did.
Yes.
And if you didn't go to church, your relatives who lived with you or down the block, or then they would say, how come Bob's not going to church?
Sure.
That doesn't exist anymore. If there's nobody sitting around wondering if Matt Kelly's going to go to Mass on Sunday, except maybe his wife or his kids. So is it really that much different, or are we just identifying a problem?
I don't think it's that much different. I think we're just identifying a problem. I think it's manifesting in modern ways. Mm-hmm. In 1600, there was nothing else to do on a Sunday morning. Mm-hmm. That's what everyone did. That's what you did. That was, in many ways, that was the social thing, right? As much as the spiritual thing. You know, in 2000...
Which is in many ways you find in some of the mega church Protestant experiences as well.
No question. You know, today there's 1,000 things people can do on a Sunday morning.
Right. Without ever getting out of bed, in fact, actually.
That's a good point.
You know, with their iPad and their iPhone or whatever, right? Now, you talk about appearance versus authentic. And you talk about our own age seems to be governed by illusion and deception. So how does one know what's authentic if everything seems virtual?
I think we know it when we see it. Mm-hmm. You know, I don't think you have to be a Catholic. I don't think you have to be a faithful Catholic to meet Mother Teresa and say, there's something powerful here, mm-hmm. There's something, this woman just drips authenticity. Mm-hmm. And so we do actually know the authentic when we see it. Mm-hmm. But, you know, so much is, even reality TV is fake, right? It's
you
a
bet.
show.
It's orchestrated.
It's
right.
orchestrated. And the fact that that has come as such a mega blockbuster hit during this period in history, mm-hmm. I think is the best example of what I'm talking about there. Mm-hmm. The problem is we yearn for the authentic, mm-hmm. right? We yearn for the authentic in God. We yearn for God through authentic relationships. We yearn for God in truth, beauty, and goodness. And these things are becoming less and less available on a daily basis to most people.
Mm-hmm. Now, you say in the prevailing philosophy, every culture is the fruit of the ideas and attitudes of its people. These attitudes and ideas come together in both people and cultures to form philosophies. Our own age is one great philosophical poverty. And as a result, we live in an age of tremendous moral and ethical confusion. What do you mean? There's no philosophy that people are living under?
Well, everyone's living under a philosophy.
It's their own philosophy?
Well, the practical philosophies.
Okay.
I think our age is being governed by practical philosophies, you know, like minimalism and hedonism, okay. and individualism and materialism.
Right, and that's what you talk about.
Yeah, which really are default philosophies. Nobody wakes up one morning and says, yep, hedonism is the best way to live, and I'm now going to dedicate my life to hedonism. We tend to just fall into these philosophies, mm-hmm. whereas, you know, the great minds of any period of time ask the question, how is the best way to live? Mm-hmm. And a philosophy forms out of that question.
Right. It's interesting because a lot of times individualism, we get into the discussion about, you know, people should be able to make their own decisions. I guess what your kind of radical individualism is really the idea that everything is about me ultimately, and my decisions are all based on what's best for me personally, period.
Yeah, and I think Pope Francis is talking a lot about that at the moment. The whole idea that we're very self-referential. You know, we use self as the sort of the ultimate guidepost, as the ultimate point of reference.
We're our own benchmark.
That's a very dangerous pastime.
Right. You say the fruits of individualism are no secret to any of us: greed, selfishness, and exploitation. And hedonism, I mean, certainly coming out of the 60s and 70s and things like that. I mean, I guess the great allure with those kind of things is the consequences don't show up that quickly. And people get involved with these things, and it's only once they're there, they realize later that, and sometimes they feel trapped in that.
I think that's true on one level. I think there's a different reality on another level, because if we're really in tune with our hearts, if we're really in tune with how we feel or respond to things, then we know that these things don't bring happiness to our lives. You know, for the last, let's say, 50 years, since some point in the 60s, we've been getting more and more of what we want every day on an ever-increasing basis. Our culture still says getting what you want is the key to happiness. And yet, for 50 years, we've been getting more of what we want, and people are not happier.
It leads to despair in many cases, because people think this is supposed to make them happy, and when it doesn't, then they realize, well, what is going to make me happy?
Exactly.
Nothing.
People are more irritable, more restless, more discontented than ever before.
You say they're exhausted in a sense. They
are exhausted.
Kind of been overwhelmed. And you talk about the minimalistic. I thought this was interesting too, because it's that idea of what's the least I can do to get by in a lot of ways. Not, you know, what I can do, how I can excel, how I can stand out, but what's the least I can do and still get by?
Yeah, that's and it affects every area of life, right? Some people approach marriage like that. Some people approach work like that. A lot of people approach Catholicism like that.
Right, exactly. In fact, there was a book that I remember a number of years ago was written. It was kind of like, what's the least you can do and still be a good Catholic, or something like that. You know, and you say to yourself, is that really where we're at now here, trying to figure out how to get a pass-fail, you know, how I can get through. You know, if I hand in my sheets, does that mean, Lord, I can get into heaven?
It's the wrong question, right?
Right. Now, let's just talk quickly about the 4 signs of a dynamic Catholic. Now, so this was basically you looking at the numbers and how we're doing. And what we're finding out is that, as you said before, that there's a small percentage of people who are not only going to Mass, and a smaller percentage of those people in the parish themselves who are really engaged with what's going on in the parish. Why do people feel comfortable? Is it because many of the parishes are so big and they don't feel like it's welcoming enough? You know, when we talk about things being welcomed, or is it just that people don't feel that there's a reason for them to get involved? I used to think in terms of the idea that when I was growing up as a kid, the analogy of the National Guard is, you know, the clergy of the military. We show up on Sunday for maneuvers, do our training, and then we go back to our civilian life during the week, and then we should go back and do our maneuvers on the weekend. But we're not supposed to be doing anything during the week.
Right. I think that if you put a bucket under a dripping faucet, it doesn't matter how slow the drip is. Eventually the bucket fills, and once the bucket fills, it overflows. It doesn't actually have a choice. It's completely involuntary. It has to overflow. I think the dripping tap it's prayer, it's the sacraments, it's scriptures. You know, the bucket's our hearts, our souls. And as they fill up, they have to overflow.
Right.
I think the problem is we're not helping enough people to get to that full and overflowing place. You know,
and that's the kind of thing in many cases, in at least at different times, Curcio, our marriage encounter, the charismatic renewal, some of the lay movements and things like that, the work you're doing, other people are doing, even people getting to watch EWTN, where you try to say, the people who become excited about their faith, they don't leave the parish to work on other things. They become the people who want to get involved and care about their parish. They're the ones who get excited about their faith.
There's no question. You know, and the more they know about it, the more excited they get.
Right.
You know, and so we have to keep that dripping. You know, we have to keep feeding that. You know, whether it's through prayer or through study or through.
Right. You say prayer, study, generosity, and evangelization. The 3 sound pretty straightforward. Generosity. What is that? What do we mean?
So when we did the research, we tried to work out what's the difference between the 7% and the other 93%, and they were the 4 things that we discovered. In the area of generosity, we talk a lot about stewardship, time, talent, treasure. I mean, these people are off the charts generous in those areas. But they're also generous in lots of other ways. They're generous with their virtue. They're generous with their encouragement. They're generous. They're just generous people.
Right.
Their generosity just has tentacles that reaches into every area of their life.
Right.
And truth is, I mean, if we really want to bring the genius of Catholicism to life, if we really want to bring Christ to people, one of the easiest ways to do that is just to astound people with our generosity. You know, because people don't expect generosity in our culture today.
In fact, they check their pockets if you're too generous.
Exactly. You know, they feel like, oh, what's the angle?
Yeah, what's the con here?
So let's, I mean, just astound people with our generosity, I think is one way to make a case for Christ and the church.
Right, and be authentic, as you say. Well, thank you so much. You're doing fabulous work.
Thank you,
Doug. You don't need me to tell you that.
Thank
you so much. Keep it up. Matthew Kelly, so much really is being put out by his organization. The book Rediscover Catholicism by Beacon Publishing, also The 4 Signs of a Dynamic Catholic, and he's also got, you can hear his own reading of his books as well on audio if you'd like. So I'm Doug Keck. Join us next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark.